So I'll be honest, I actually had a hard time coming up with something to say about this race at Road America. And it's not because this was a boring race or something like I saw some people saying on Twitter. It's a little bit of the opposite because what Alexander Rossi did in dominating the field was so special. It's almost hard to even kind of comprehend what he did yesterday at Road America. And, you can always lead, and I'm sure many people have led with the Alexander Rossi wins most dominating performance we've seen in a very long time. The problem is that we've been saying that an awful lot this recently. We said that after Long Beach, and before that we said it at Pocono. Now we're saying it again, and each time we say it, the dominance becomes even larger. The gaps between first and second when Alexander Rossi is winning races are larger. And this race was perhaps of all of Rossi's wins, and most of them have been incredibly dominant. This one was the race where there was the least amount of doubt. It was a caution-free race. He only lost the lead for one lap, I believe. I think he led 54 out of 55 laps. And I would be very interested to see the last time a winner led this high a percentage of the race. I'm sure you would have to go back probably to the 90s, and I would almost say probably the 80s. To get to that level of dominance. Well, then again, Ryan Hunter-Reay led all of the laps of a Champ Car race, so I guess that's the answer to the trivia question. Ryan Hunter-Reay led like 250 laps at Milwaukee one year. So since 2003, this is probably the most dominating race since 2003, and wow, and thinking about this is again, it's almost in spite of IndyCar. And I don't mean that in like a negative connotation. But IndyCar is championed for so long about how close the competition is and how anybody can win and how close the technical regulations are, all of this stuff. We do see it, obviously, at places like Indianapolis, where it does feel like, man, yeah, 5 or 6 guys are almost guaranteed to be in contention on the last lap of the Indy 500. This was the kind of performance, this was the kind of dominance that we would have expected in the 80s or 90s. And it happened in the year 2019 when IndyCar racing is just so different than what it used to be. I mean, this is just Alexander Rossi. He's the kind of driver who I truly believe would have been able to do this in any era. He really, I mean, it's obvious now. It is plain obvious as day. He is the guy. I mean, he is the next guy because just generational talent. And it's amazing to me, and I've said this before, it's amazing because a lot of people were poo-pooing his 2016 Indy 500. A lot of people said he was the worst Indy 500 winner of all time at the time. And wow, those people have been proved wrong. It is amazing. And you have to look at the schedule going forward, and you have to think that he's probably going to be the championship contender. Now, obviously, Joseph Newgarden, and we're going to talk about him a little bit later, has had better luck. He's had better strategy, thanks in part to Tim Cindric. And obviously, he's been driving very well as well. I don't want to take anything away from Joseph Newgarden. But I think, I mean, when you're winning a race with a spec chassis, obviously there are some things that are different. But for all intents and purposes, you've got a spec series, and a guy is blowing the field away by 30 seconds. And these are guys... these are guys that outqualified Fernando Alonso at the Indy 500 this year. I know. And speaking of Formula One, here's another interesting thing to kind of consider and think about. And I said this at Long Beach because I had another Grand Prix to compare it to at that point. But the French Grand Prix, which everybody said was one of the worst Formula One races they've ever seen. The margin of victory was 18 seconds between Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri Bottas. Wow. Does that put it in perspective? And by the way, the NASCAR Cup Series race with the mandatory cautions and all that, sure, the gap between first and second, Martin Truex Jr. and Kyle Busch was about 2 seconds, but the gap between Busch and third place was 35 seconds. I don't know if that means a whole lot, but it's certainly interesting to kind of see throughout this weekend. This was a weekend of dominance. It definitely showed a lot of people across the board in motorsports being very dominant. And a lot of the talk now has been about Rossi and where Rossi will go next year. In fact, prior to the race itself, Robin Miller put Tim Cindric on the spot on NBC Gold and asked him straight up, are you going to run a fourth car next year and try to get Alexander Rossi? Cindric did not answer their question, but he also didn't deny that they were thinking about doing it. So where is Alexander Rossi going to end up in 2020? And I know a lot of people thinking maybe he's going to go to Penske. A lot of people are saying that that'll ruin the show. But I would point out that, just a couple years ago, Penske had four of the best in the business, and they didn't win all the races. And in fact, they lost the championship to Scott Dixon. Go figure. So, if he gets signed to Penske, which, by the way, I don't think is going to be what happens. And I also don't think he's going to go to F1. I know a lot of people were suggesting that he goes to Haas F1. We know what Gunther Steiner has said about American drivers, so probably not. And I don't think Mercedes or Ferrari would take him. A lot of people have been saying Red Bull, but Red Bull seems to like to sign people who are signed to them already. And unless Rossi signs a Red Bull contract here in the next couple of days, I don't see that happening either. I think the best course of action for Alexander Rossi is to stay at Michael Andretti's team. Very simple. If you're winning races, you're beating Penske by 30 seconds already. You've got the team around you that can produce those kind of results. Why on earth would you go anywhere else? The only thing I could kind of consider would be the Indy 500. Obviously, I don't think it's any real secret that the Honda engine isn't necessarily the preferred one at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. For whatever reason, that doesn't seem to apply to Pocono. I guess Pocono's a little bit more of a handling track these days. But so I guess if he wants to win every Indy 500 for the next 10 years, I guess he could go to Penske. But from a championship, race wins, legacy standpoint, you'd almost think that Andretti, with his current team, is kind of the best place for him to stay. I think that's where he should stay. We'll have to see, down the line whether or not that's going to hold true. So the other amazing performance, and one that's not getting as much credit for obvious reasons, but I still want to talk about it, is Scott Dixon. Got spun out on the very first lap of the race by Ryan Hunter-Reay going down into Station 5 at Road America. Was 10 seconds behind last place, 22nd spot. And throughout the race, worked his way all the way back through the field with some fantastic driving, some great strategy to get back up into contention, even though he was never really close to winning the race. That was, if Rossi hadn't put 30 seconds on everybody, including the Penskes, I would have said that Scott Dixon's performance was one of the best of the season, because it really was. And I really wanted to add a little bit of highlight to that, because, again, there were some people who said, oh, this race was no good, but you don't go from 10 seconds behind the final placed car and all the way up into 5th or 6th spot without having passed some people, having had some racing. And that was the thing, is that if you didn't pay attention to Rossi, definitely Road America was the best race of the weekend from the major series, at least. In terms of on-track competition, I think it was the best. In fact, it was kind of interesting. I pointed this out on Twitter. It was weird to see drivers pull out of the draft on the long straightaways at Road America, and then you could very clearly tell that the drivers that kind of stayed in line pulled away. So it was weird to see the draft actually be a thing on a road course. It's just an observation of mine that it just kind of made me think it was weird, and it certainly meant passing what became a bit of a premium. We saw with Takuma Sato and James Hinchcliffe kind of getting into each other. A lot of bumping and banging as well. But people were just braking so late into the corners, and just really, Colton Herta was one of the other guys who was just really the last of the late breakers. It caught him out a couple of times, obviously, but man, there was definitely some exciting racing. So I don't think we can really say that it was an absolutely horrible race. So let's to finish this off, because, again, I don't really have all that much to say about a race where Alexander Rossi leads 54 laps. Let's go through the top 10 and talk about some of the performances that may have been overlooked by Alexander Rossi. So we obviously already talked about Alexander Rossi, the winner. I don't need to talk about him. He led 54 laps or whatever. Will Power. he had a fantastic quote. I don't remember who he gave it to. He may have given it to NBC, but he said something to the effect of, "I would have said we had a great car today if Alexander Rossi hadn't been in the race." But wow. And again, that kind of talks to Alexander Rossi's performance, how far ahead of the field he was, that Will Power would say something like that. Third place was Joseph Newgarden, who actually continues to hold the championship lead. Who knows how long he's going to have it, but yeah, he's just been consistent. And again, he had the one mistake in Detroit. And by the way, we may be talking about Detroit once again, and a mistake in Detroit determining the championship. We'll have to see what happens between Rossi and Newgarden going down the stretch of the season. But that could be the deciding factor once again at Detroit. Graham Rahal, running the Graham, or the Bobby Rahal tribute livery, which, by the way, I did kind of get in a little bit of hot water on Twitter because I pointed out that it was a throwback livery to a sponsor that's not on that team, and therefore the sponsor was getting a lot of the sponsor that wasn't on the car was getting a lot more airtime and coverage than the sponsor that was on the car. Just like to point that out about throwback liveries. But he actually drove a lot like his dad. He wasn't really a contender for the lead, and even though he challenged a bit for the podium, it didn't really look like he had the best car. And as someone who kind of started watching racing kind of at the tail end of Bobby Rahal's career, that felt like a lot like one of his dad's races, to me at least, and it was kind of fitting that he was in the MGD tribute car. Scott Dixon, talked about him, 23rd to 5th on a race that had no cautions. That's some fantastic strategy from Mike Hull, and obviously some great driving from Scott Dixon. Felix Rosenqvist, I think I heard that he's in the Rookie of the Year standings lead now, somehow, against all odds. That's kind of fascinating, considering that a lot of people have kind of been writing him off as having a horrible year. Yeah, not too bad for Felix Rosenqvist. And again, I think he said right after the race to NBC, it was a fairly legitimate result because there were no safety cars, as he said. Then we go down to James Hinchcliffe, who had a pretty decent day, all things considered. It's one of the first times this season he's kind of outshone Ericsson, which is kind of weird to say, but that's kind of what's happened to Hinch this year. Hinch probably will have a couple of good races coming up. Obviously, he always comes to play in the hometown of Toronto, and then also Iowa Speedway. He's the defending winner of that race. So I think Hinchcliffe fans will have some stuff to look forward to. Colton Herta became, and again, I hope I haven't understated this too much, but he became the youngest pole sitter in IndyCar history. It was the only man to beat Rossi this weekend, though he was the only guy to lead Rossi legitimately, at least at the start of the race, and then Rossi passed him around the outside, and it was the end of the race, essentially from there. Really bad strategy, and I know he's already addressed this on Twitter and whatnot, but I need to call it out because I was kind of surprised because I didn't know it was a rule that you had to run sticker reds and sticker blacks. I didn't know that either they've changed that rule, that's just a rule I haven't been aware of, but it felt like they weren't aware of it either because they started on scrubbed reds, and with the way the red tires were reacting to the track, that was obviously a really bad, it was a really bad call, and it's unfortunate to see Colton get taken out for a strategy call. Yeah, that was a shame. But boy, oh boy, was he exciting to watch on that last stint on red tires when everybody else was on slightly healthier black tires, and Herta was sliding around and could barely drive the car in turn one. But he didn't crash. He almost did into the back of Graham Rahal, but once again, Herta's just very impressive, but boy, oh boy, he's just had the worst luck so far this year. Hopefully he'll get another result to match his win at Circuit of the Americas. I think that's one of the things that people are going to start forgetting about because of all the bad luck, unfortunately, with Colton Herta. Simon Pagenaud in 9th. He's been pretty anonymous, hasn't he, since winning the Indianapolis 500. I think he's admitted to having Indy 500 hangover. Thankfully, there's a couple of weeks break here, so I'm hoping that Simon Pagenaud will kind of get back to being a little bit more competitive over the next couple of races after a bit of a break, because I don't think he's going to Watkins Glen with the IMSA team. So yeah, he'll have a bit of shut-eye. And then rounding out the top 10 was Takuma Sato, who seems to be falling off a little bit on that championship form. Everybody felt like he was on there for a couple of minutes there. It felt like Takuma Sato might be a championship contender. He still might be. There's some good Takuma Sato tracks coming up in the schedule, but yeah, he's starting to look a little bit more like the old Sato, hitting a lot of things recently. So I don't know. We'll have to see. But there's your top 10. Hopefully, I've been able to give you a decent analysis of this race because, again, it's kind of hard to analyze outside of just saying how great Alexander Rossi is. But this is kind of the summer break of the season, even though there's another summer break before Pocono or after Pocono or whatever. But then there's racing in Canada at Toronto on July 14th. So, I'm going to be covering that as well. So thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and I will see you in the next video.